The night was colder than he expected. Luke tightened his coat around him as he stepped out of the coffee shop, the warmth of the cafe vanishing the second the wind hit him. He shoved his hands into his pockets, ready to make the walk back to his apartment when something caught his eye: a woman, shivering on the sidewalk, hugging herself as if that would somehow block out the cold. She wasn't dressed for this kind of weather. Her thin sweater clung to her, soaked from the light drizzle that had started to fall. Dark hair stuck to her face, and she rubbed her arms furiously, her whole body trembling. Luke hesitated for half a second before instinct kicked in. He pulled off his jacket and stepped toward her. "Here," he said, draping it over her shoulders before she could protest. She startled, blinking up at him with wide, startled brown eyes. "I what?" "You're freezing," he said simply. "Take it." For a moment, she just stared at him, as if trying to decide whether to argue. Then, with a small nod, she pulled the jacket tighter around herself, her fingers clutching the fabric like it was the only thing keeping her upright. "Thanks," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. Luke nodded, shoving his now empty hands back into his pockets. He should have walked away then, should have just left it at that. But something about the way she stood there alone, soaked, exhausted, made it impossible for him to move. "Are you okay?" he found himself asking. She let out a soft, humorless laugh. "Not really." The honesty in her voice caught him off guard. Most people would have just said, "I'm fine," and left it at that. But there was nothing fine about the way she looked, like life had knocked her down one too many times, and this was just another blow. Luke exhaled, glancing around. They were standing outside a closed bookstore, the glow of the street lamp above them casting a soft light on her face. He didn't know what had happened to her, but he knew one thing: he couldn't just leave her like this. "Come on," he said, nodding toward the cafe he had just left. "Let's get you warmed up." She hesitated, her fingers tightening around his jacket. "I don't know pressure," he added quickly, "but they have coffee." "And heat." For a long moment she didn't move, then finally she let out a slow breath and nodded. "Okay." They stepped into the cafe, the warmth hitting them immediately. Luke led her to a corner booth, and she sank into the seat with a quiet sigh, still gripping his jacket like it was the only thing tethering her to reality. He ordered them both coffee, and when he returned to the table, she was staring down at the table, lost in thought. "I'm Luke, by the way," he said, setting her cup in front of her. She blinked as if she had forgotten he was there. Then, after a beat, she murmured, "Sophie." Sophie, it suited her. She wrapped her hands around the coffee cup, letting the warmth seep into her fingers. For a while, they just sat there in silence, the hum of the cafe filling the space between them. Luke didn't push her to talk, didn't ask the million questions running through his head. He just sat there, giving her the space to breathe. Finally, she exhaled and looked at him. I lost my apartment today," Luke frowned. "What?" She let out a small, bitter laugh. "My landlord decided to sell the place, gave me barely any notice. I thought I'd have more time to figure something out, but I didn't." Something heavy settled in Luke's chest. He had no idea what that kind of uncertainty felt like, but he could see it in her eyes, the exhaustion, the weight of it all pressing down on her. "Do you have anywhere to go?" he asked. She hesitated, then shook her head. "Not really." Luke didn't even think before he spoke. "You can stay at my place." Her head snapped up, eyes wide. "What?" "It's not much," he said quickly. "Just a small apartment, but it's warm and it has a couch. You can stay until you figure something out." She stared at him like he had just offered her the moon. "You don't even know me," he shrugged. "You don't know me either, but here we are." Sophie looked down at her coffee, her fingers tracing the rim of the cup. "I don't want to be a burden." "You wouldn't be," she exhaled, shaking her head. "I can't just accept charity." "It's not charity," he interrupted. "It's kindness. And last I checked, kindness wasn't a bad thing." Her lips parted slightly, as if she wanted to argue, but no words came. For a long moment, she just stared at him, like she was trying to figure out if he was real. Then, finally, she let out a slow breath and nodded. "Okay," she whispered. Luke felt something shift in his chest. He didn't know why he was doing this, didn't know why he felt this overwhelming need to help her. But as she sat there, wrapped in his jacket, looking at him like he was the first good thing to happen to her in a long time, he knew one thing for sure. This night wasn't just about offering a jacket to a shivering woman. It was the start of something he never saw coming. Luke hadn't thought this through. Bringing a stranger into his home wasn't something he made a habit of, but as he led Sophie up the narrow staircase to his apartment, he knew he couldn't have done anything else. She was still clutching his jacket around her shoulders, her steps hesitant, as if she was waiting for him to change his mind. When they reached his door, he unlocked it and pushed it open, stepping aside to let her in first. "It's not much," he said, suddenly feeling self-conscious about the small space. The living room was tidy but lived in books stacked on the coffee table, a jacket draped over the back of the couch, and a half-full mug on the counter from this morning's coffee. Sophie stepped inside cautiously, her eyes scanning the room. "It's nice," she murmured. He wasn't sure if she meant it or was just being polite, but either way, she didn't look uncomfortable, which was a relief. "You can take the couch," he said, nodding toward it. "It's not the most comfortable thing in the world, but it beats the sidewalk." She let out a small breath that could have been a laugh. "Yeah, I imagine it does." Luke grabbed a spare blanket from the closet and tossed it onto the couch. "Bathrooms down the hall if you need it. Fresh towels are in the cabinet." She nodded, still gripping his jacket tightly, her fingers curling around the fabric as if letting it go would make this all disappear. He hesitated before speaking again. "Are you hungry?" Her eyes flicked up to his, and for the first time he noticed just how tired she looked. There was a weight behind them, something deep and unspoken. "I could eat," she admitted, her voice small. Luke nodded and headed toward the kitchen. He wasn't much of a cook, but he could manage something simple. He pulled out a loaf of bread, some eggs, and cheese. Grilled cheese and scrambled eggs, basic but warm. Sophie sat at the small dining table, watching him move around the kitchen. He wasn't sure if she was studying him or if she was just too exhausted to look anywhere else. "You do this often?" she asked after a moment. "What? Bring strangers home, feed them, offer them your couch?" He smirked, flipping the sandwich in the pan. "No." "First time, actually," she arched a brow. "Really? Really?" There was a long pause before she spoke again. "Why me?" Luke glanced over his shoulder, meeting her gaze. There was something vulnerable in her expression, something that told him she wasn't used to people doing things for her. He could have given her a dozen different answers, but he settled on the truth. "You looked like you needed someone," he said simply. She didn't respond right away, but the way her lips pressed together told him that his words had struck something deep. A few minutes later, he set a plate in front of her. She hesitated for just a second before picking up the sandwich and taking a bite. The way her shoulders relaxed, just slightly, told him everything he needed to know. They ate in comfortable silence. Afterward, Sophie helped him rinse the dishes, and then she stood in the middle of the living room, looking uncertain. "You should get some rest," he said, nodding toward the couch. She nodded slowly, but she didn't move right away. Instead, she looked at him, really looked at him, like she was trying to figure him out. "Thank you," she said softly, and something about the way she said it made his chest tighten. "Anytime," he murmured. She settled onto the couch, pulling the blanket over herself. He lingered for a moment, watching as she curled up, her breathing steadying. For some reason, he found himself standing there longer than he should have, just watching her. He didn't know why he cared so much, but he did, and that scared him more than he wanted to admit. Luke woke to the distant sound of movement. It took him a second to remember why he wasn't alone in his apartment, why there was a presence in the next room that hadn't been there the night before. Then it hit him: Sophie. He sat up, rubbing his face, trying to shake off the haze of sleep. The apartment was dimly lit by the early morning light creeping through the curtains. He swung his legs off the bed and stretched before stepping quietly into the living room. Sophie was standing by the window, his jacket still draped around her shoulders, her arms wrapped around herself as she gazed outside. She hadn't noticed him yet. Luke hesitated. She looked lost in thought, her expression distant, and he didn't want to startle her. But something about the way she stood there, so small and fragile in the morning light, made his chest tighten. "You didn't sleep," he said softly. She flinched, turning quickly. She stopped, looking almost guilty. "I did a little." Luke didn't buy it. The dark smudges under her eyes told him otherwise. "Couch too uncomfortable?" he asked, crossing his arms. She shook her head. "No, it's not that, I just—" Her voice trailed off and she let out a small sigh. "I guess I'm not used to this, someone helping me." The admission was quiet, but it carried weight. Luke didn't press her for more. Instead, he nodded toward the kitchen. "Coffee," Sophie hesitated before offering a small, tired smile. "Yeah. Coffee sounds good." He busied himself with the coffee maker, the rich aroma filling the apartment. Sophie took a seat at the small table, watching him. He could feel her eyes on him, but he didn't call attention to it. When he placed a mug in front of her, she wrapped her hands around it, holding it like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. "I should probably start looking for a new place today," she murmured. Luke took a sip of his own coffee, studying her. "You got anywhere in mind?" She let out a small, humorless laugh. "Not really. It's not like I have a lot of options. Rent's ridiculous, and I don't exactly have savings to fall back on." That clenched something deep inside him. "You have a job?" he asked. She nodded. "Yeah, I work at a bookstore. It doesn't pay much, but it's steady." Luke leaned back in his chair. "Then stay here." "At least until you find something." Sophie blinked, like she hadn't expected him to say that. "Luke, I mean it," he interrupted before she could argue. "You don't have to rush out. You don't have to figure everything out overnight. Just take a breath." She stared at him, something unreadable in her expression. Then finally she exhaled and nodded. "Okay," she whispered. Relief flooded him, though he wasn't entirely sure why. They spent the morning in quiet companionship. Sophie helped him straighten up the apartment, though he insisted she didn't have to. She ignored him and did it anyway. And somehow, between the small conversations and shared silences, the tension she had carried when she first walked in seemed to ease. By noon, she was curled up on the couch, flipping through one of his books. Luke sat on the opposite end, pretending to read but really just watching her from the corner of his eye. He didn't know why he was so drawn to her. Maybe it was the way she carried herself, strong despite the weight she was clearly holding. Maybe it was the way she had looked at him when he offered her help, like she wasn't sure how to accept kindness. Or maybe it was something deeper, something he wasn't ready to admit. But one thing was certain: she wasn't just some stranger anymore, and that scared him more than anything. The days passed in a quiet rhythm neither of them had expected. Sophie still hadn't found a place, but Luke hadn't brought it up again. She was still staying on his couch, still using his coffee mugs in the morning, still curling up with a book from his shelf at night, and somehow it all felt natural, like she had always been there. Luke wasn't sure when he had started looking for her when he walked into the apartment, or when he started noticing the way her lips curved slightly when she read something she liked, or the way she tucked her hair behind her ear when she was concentrating. She was getting more comfortable, less hesitant, and he was getting used to her being there in a way that scared him. One evening, after another long day at the auto shop, Luke walked in to find Sophie standing at the stove, stirring something in a pan. The scent of garlic and tomatoes filled the air, warm and inviting. He lingered in the doorway, watching her. "You're cooking?" he asked, raising a brow. She turned slightly, giving him a small smile. "You've been feeding me for days. I figured it was time I returned the favor." Luke smirked, tossing his keys onto the counter. "I didn't expect you to." "I know," she shrugged, "but I wanted to." He didn't argue. Instead, he grabbed 2 plates and set them on the counter. They ate at the tiny kitchen table, the soft glow of the overhead light making the space feel smaller, more intimate. Sophie had made pasta, and it was good. Simple, but good. "This is better than anything I've made," Luke admitted after a bite. Sophie laughed, shaking her head. You make a mean grilled cheese, he chuckled. High praise. Silence settled between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of quiet that felt settled, easy. After a while, Sophie set down her fork and leaned back in her chair. I had an interview today. Luke looked up, surprised. Yeah, she nodded. It's for a second job, evening shifts mostly. It's not great pay, but it'll help me save up faster. Something about that made his stomach tighten. The thought of her working herself to exhaustion just to afford a place made his chest ache. You don't have to rush out of here, he found himself saying. Sophie's gaze met his, something unreadable flickering in her eyes. I can't stay forever. I know, Luke said. But you don't have to burn yourself out trying to leave, either. She exhaled, looking down at her hands. I just don't want to take advantage of your kindness. You're not. His voice was firm, steady. I want you here, Sophie. Her breath hitched slightly at his words, and Luke realized what he had just said. He wanted her here, not just because she needed a place, because he wanted her. The realization hit him like a freight train, but he didn't take it back. Sophie swallowed, looking down at her plate. I don't know what to say to that. You don't have to say anything, he murmured. The air between them shifted. Something unspoken hung there, heavy and undeniable. After a moment, Sophie stood, picking up her plate. I'll clean up, she said, her voice quieter than before. Luke watched her move around the kitchen, his chest tight. He had no idea what was happening between them, but he knew one thing for sure. He was falling, and there was no stopping it now. Luke never thought his quiet, predictable life could change so quickly. But every morning, he woke up to the sound of Sophie moving around his apartment. Every evening, he came home to find her curled up on his couch. And every night, he lay in bed thinking about her. She had become a part of his world, seamlessly fitting into spaces he hadn't even realized were empty. And the worst part, he didn't want her to leave, but he knew she would. Sophie had started working both jobs, and every day she came home looking more exhausted than the last. He hated seeing the dark circles under her eyes, hated the way she barely ate before collapsing onto the couch. He wanted to tell her to slow down, to stay, but he had no right to ask that of her. So instead, he did what he could. He made sure there was always food in the fridge, that the coffee was ready in the mornings before she stumbled into the kitchen, half asleep. He pretended not to notice when she borrowed his sweatshirts, because they were warmer than the threadbare sweaters she owned. And he told himself it was enough. But then, one night, everything changed. Luke had just finished showering when he heard the apartment door creak open. It was later than usual. Sophie's second shift usually ended by 10, but it was almost midnight. Something was wrong. He stepped into the living room, his damp hair clinging to his forehead, and found Sophie standing just inside the doorway. Her shoulders were hunched, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. And the second she looked up at him, he knew. She had been crying. Luke's chest tightened. He crossed the room in 3 strides, reaching for her without thinking. Sophie, I got fired, she whispered. His hands froze just before they touched her. What? She let out a shaky breath, blinking rapidly like she was trying to hold back tears. The bookstore. They let me go, Luke's jaw clenched. Why? Sophie shook her head. The owner sold the place, new management, they're bringing in their own people. She let out a hollow laugh. I didn't even see it coming. Luke exhaled sharply. He wanted to punch something. That's unfair, she said bitterly. Yeah. She swayed slightly, and without thinking, Luke reached out, steadying her. His hands found her arms, and the second he touched her, she let out a soft, broken sound. And then, just like that, she crumbled. She fell into him, burying her face in his chest, her fingers gripping the fabric of his shirt. Luke didn't hesitate. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her close, feeling the way her body trembled against his. I don't know what to do, she whispered against him. Luke closed his eyes. You don't have to figure it out tonight, she let out a shaky breath. I feel like I'm running out of time. He pulled back just enough to look at her, his hands still resting on her arms. "You're not alone in this, Sophie." Her eyes searched his, wide and uncertain. "Luke." Before she could finish, he reached up, gently brushing away a tear that had escaped down her cheek. His fingers lingered, his thumb skimming her skin. And then something shifted. The air between them grew heavy, charged, her breath hitched. And for the first time, Luke let himself admit the truth. He didn't just care about Sophie. He was in love with her, and if she walked out of his life, he wasn't sure how he'd recover. Sophie's lips parted slightly, her gaze flickering down to his mouth. Luke's heart pounded. He should step back, let her breathe. But then she moved first. She reached up, hesitated for only a second, then curled her fingers around the front of his shirt, pulling him closer. That was all it took. Luke closed the distance, his lips capturing hers in a kiss that was slow, deep, and filled with everything he hadn't been able to say. Sophie let out a soft sound, pressing closer, her hands sliding up to his shoulders. He kissed her like he was afraid she'd disappear. Like she was something precious, something he couldn't bear to lose. And when they finally broke apart, both breathless, Sophie looked up at him with something raw in her eyes. "I don't want to leave," she whispered. Luke exhaled, resting his forehead against hers. "Then don't." For the first time in weeks, she didn't argue, she just nodded. The morning after their kiss, the world felt different. Sophie woke up wrapped in warmth, the scent of coffee drifting through the apartment. The weight of last night still lingered on her lips, the memory of Luke's touch branded into her skin. She had kissed him, he had kissed her, and everything had changed. She sat up on the couch, pulling the blanket tighter around her as she tried to steady the rushing in her chest. It wasn't just the kiss that had shaken her, it was the way he had held her, the way he had looked at her afterward like she was something precious, something he couldn't bear to lose. And the truth was, she didn't want to lose him either. She pushed to her feet, padding softly toward the kitchen, where Luke was pouring coffee into 2 mugs. He glanced up when he saw her, his lips pulling into a slow, almost hesitant smile. "Morning," he said, his voice rough from sleep. Sophie swallowed, her heart doing something ridiculous in her chest. "Morning." He held out a mug and she took it, their fingers brushing for half a second too long. Neither of them moved away. Luke's gaze searched hers, like he was waiting for her to say something, to set the course for whatever this was between them. But she didn't have the words, not yet. So instead, she took a sip of coffee and leaned against the counter, trying to gather her thoughts. "I meant what I said last night," Luke murmured after a beat. Sophie looked up. "About what?" His eyes softened. "About not wanting you to leave." Her fingers tightened around the mug. "Luke, I know you think you have to figure everything out on your own," he said, his voice steady. "But you don't. You don't have to do this alone, Sophie." Her breath hitched. For so long, she had been fighting, struggling to keep herself afloat. She had been so used to relying on no one but herself that she had forgotten what it felt like to have someone stand beside her. And now, here was Luke, offering her something she had never dared to hope for, a place to belong. She set her coffee down, inhaling deeply. "I don't want to be a burden." Luke's expression turned exasperated, like he had been expecting her to say that. He took a step closer, his hands finding her waist, his touch firm and grounding. "You're not a burden," he said, his voice low. "You never were." Sophie swallowed hard, her pulse hammering. "Then what am I?" Luke exhaled, his forehead dipping until it rested against hers. "You're the best damn thing that's ever happened to me." Her breath caught. She knew in that moment there was no going back. She could have fought it, could have walked away, convinced herself this was temporary. But she didn't want to. She wanted this. She wanted him. So she did the only thing that made sense. She kissed him. Luke let out a low sound of surprise before pulling her closer, his arms wrapping around her like he had been waiting for this, waiting for her, all along. The kiss was slow, deep, filled with something that made her knees weak. This wasn't a moment of desperation or uncertainty. This was something real, something solid. When they finally broke apart, Luke cupped her face, his thumb brushing tenderly over her cheek. "Stay," he murmured. Sophie's heart pounded. She had spent so much of her life searching for stability, for a place where she felt safe. And now, standing here, wrapped in Luke's arms, she realized she had found it. Not in a place, but in him. She let out a shaky breath, then nodded. Okay. Luke's lips curved into the most beautiful smile she had ever seen, and just like that, the fight was over. She wasn't alone anymore. She was home, with him,